With the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement at its highest, I thought it would be relevant to look at racism today in Europe versus in the US. Clearly, the US and Europe have different histories when it comes to racism. But how present is racism in today's Europe and today's US, and which of the two has come further in the fight against racism? All of that's coming up in today's video. Alright, so before we begin, I just want to say that I understand that this is a sore subject, especially right now, but it is very important that we talk about these issues. And let me just say that the vast majority of people think that racism is wrong. Your average person out there thinks that it is wrong, period. But there still is racism in the world today, and that goes for Europe just as well as the US. So first, we will look into what is actually dividing people by race, and then we will look at some statistics about the US and Europe. So the reason I wanted to do this video is that the recent protests in America has spread all across the Atlantic into Europe. In countries across Europe, thousands of people are now gathering in protests to show solidarity with George Floyd and the greater movement against racism. However, just like in the US, some protesters have broken off from the law-abiding crowd to angry riots. Now, all fair-minded people are against rioting in the streets. It doesn't solve anything. It only ruins the livelihood of a lot of people. What's interesting is that the media in both parts of the world have been, at the very least, unwilling to call this out. And in truth, the media is a big part of the problem. In recent times, a lot of the mainstream media have gone from objective news sources to political activism. Turn on Fox News and CNN and you'll get two completely different versions of the same story. In the US especially, this creates an ugly and intentional divide. On one hand, you'll have Democrats going on CNN, MSNBC, and so on to appeal to their base. On the other hand, you have Republicans going to Fox News. Politicians do this not because they are interested in spreading the news, but because they're interested in spreading their political agenda. Everything on President Trump on CNN is all bad all the time, and on Fox News, Trump can do no wrong. So you see, the media has been really effective in splitting people, and in these times there's almost no room for an independent, down-the-middle, moderate candidate. If someone ran as an independent and was given a fair shot by the media, he could probably appeal to a lot of people who are just moderates, both left and right. But by and large, that is not allowed. Let's take a look at this article. It reads, "In changing US electorate, race and education remain stark dividing lines." So this article goes into talking about how the Democrats have a strong hold on black voters and the Republicans have a strong hold on white voters. Now, that might not come as a surprise to any of you watching, but let's read on from down here. A new analysis by Pew Research Center of long-term trends in party affiliation based on surveys conducted among more than 360,000 registered voters over the past 25 years, including more than 12,000 in 2018 and 19, finds only modest changes in recent years. Overall, 34% of registered voters identify as independents, 33% as Democrats, and 29% as Republicans. The share of voters identifying as Republicans is now the same as it was in 2016 after having ticked down in 2017. Democratic identification is unchanged. Slightly fewer voters identify as independents than in 2017. See, if the political system would actually allow an independent candidate to come in, there's a big chance that that candidate could actually come in and wipe out the old divide. As it says here, an independent or third-party candidate would probably have the majority of people voting on their side. Now, if he was a moderate at the same time, he would probably wipe the whole field. But that would mean a lot of lifelong politicians would lose power, and that can't be allowed. The nastiest of this political divide is when it is indirectly done to separate people by race. Republicans know that they generally have white people voting for them, and Democrats know that they generally have black people voting for them. And so you'll get statements like these.
It's a long way until November. We got more questions.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
That is a rare insight into how lifelong politicians actually think. If you're this and this color, you have to vote for me. That is the worst argument of all time. So Europe doesn't really have that same issue because all countries in Europe are different, and no news organization is that big as to influence more than pretty much one country. The second factor that we should look at is our different history. The history of accepted racism has been put behind Europe for longer than it has in the US, and that might explain the difference in statistics when it comes to racially motivated crimes. In 2017 and 18 in the US, there were around 4,000 crimes each year that were racially motivated. In the same time, in European countries, on average, there would be 150 crimes. Now, it's important to note that all countries in Europe are way smaller in population and size than the US, obviously. The one country that does stand out in Europe is the UK. But to be fair to the UK, most of those crimes take place in London, and the vast majority of the crimes are not against black people, but against other ethnic groups. The numbers suggest that by and large, Europe has moved on from racism. Yes, it's still going on, and especially in some individual countries, but as a whole, you can't expect there to be systemic racism anymore. Now, the US still has a fight to overcome racism, as is evident by all of these protests. But as for systemic racism, which to me is the cruelest kind, it looks like the US is winning that fight. Finally, I just want to address the George Floyd protests because they are now taking place all over Europe as well. We are all for protests, but the violent ones, they have to stop. I witnessed thousands of Danish people taking to the streets in solidarity with George Floyd, and they were protesting, and some of them became very violent. Remember that here in Denmark, we're talking about a country that has some of the least racially motivated crimes in the whole world. A country where if you're a politician or a law enforcement officer and you actually do or say something that is actually racist, you know that your career will be ended swiftly. I get the sympathy for the peaceful parts of the movements in the United States, but when it turns violent, that's when you lose my sympathy. And what annoys me is that it kind of follows the pattern all over the world. It's a bunch of kids who are bored during the pandemic, so they tear down the shops of shop owners, taking away their livelihood. So whether in the US or in Europe, we all hope for an end to racism, but let's do the protests peacefully. All right. Remember to subscribe to my channel if you liked today's video. I know today's topic can be a bit heated, so keep it peaceful in the comment section to the extent that you can, and I'll make sure to respond to you guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.